Mid-morning edition of Arirang News on this Wednesday, the 1st of April, coming to you live from Seoul. I'm Shin Se-min. Before we begin, these are the stories we're following at this hour. Different times call for drastically new measures. All people coming to South Korea from overseas are to be placed in mandatory 2-week quarantine, regardless of their nationality, health condition, or how long they plan to stay. The government hopes the move will curb the inflow of imported COVID-19 cases, all while keeping the border open. Could a deal on Seoul and Washington's defense cost-sharing agreement finally be reached in the coming hours? According to sources, maybe so. This after the prolonged delay dumps some 4,000 South Koreans working for the U.S. Forces Korea on unpaid leave. Registered overseas South Koreans voters start casting their ballots for the April 15th general election. But the coronavirus pandemic means 80,000 potential voters in 25 countries will have to forego their vote this time around. Our top story this morning, under the new anti-coronavirus policies announced recently from today, on Wednesday, South Korea will require all people arriving from overseas, even South Korean nationals, to self-isolate and be placed in quarantine for full 2 weeks. Now, the move comes as South Korea looks to stem the number of imported cases in the country without having to shut border. As of midnight this Wednesday, all arrivals that don't have a permanent residence in South Korea will be required to stay at designated government-run facilities. Those under isolation will be required to report their health conditions to the authorities via a mobile app in real time. Exemptions have also been made for diplomats, foreign government officials, and humanitarian missions entering the country. Instead, they will undergo mandatory health checkups, including a coronavirus test. Violators could face jail time or a fine, and foreigners subject to immediate deportation. Aside from that, South Korea will be bringing back a group of South Korean nationals from Italy, a country that's been hit hard by the coronavirus, on a chartered flight this afternoon. The second flight will depart on Thursday. Registered overseas South Korean voters will be able to begin casting their ballots this Wednesday for South Korea's April 15th general election. But due to the global coronavirus outbreak, 41 diplomatic missions in 25 countries will not allow overseas voting, affecting over some 80,000 potential voters, nearly half of all eligible overseas voters. Now, South Korean nationals in relatively unaffected countries will be able to cast their ballots from Wednesday until next Monday from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. at their respective polling stations, which are located in South Korean consulates and embassies. Some South Koreans in countries unable to vote have complained, asking instead to be allowed to vote in their mail-in their votes, but that option was turned down by the National Election Commission. Just days after hitting 500,000, the number of coronavirus cases worldwide has crossed the 800,000 mark with over 41,000 deaths. The U.S. has the largest number of confirmed patients at over 182,000, but experts say some parts of Europe could finally see some signs of stabilization. Our Kim Hyo-sun with more.
The coronavirus death toll in the U.S. has skyrocketed to over 3,700. According to a tally from Johns Hopkins University, the virus has now infected more than 182,000 people across the country. CNN says in New York alone, the country's hardest-hit state, more than 6,000 confirmed cases were reported on Monday. As New York struggles to combat COVID-19, a makeshift hospital is being built in the city's most famous green space, the Central Park.
What you see behind us is what we call a respiratory care unit. It's a field hospital that has 68 beds within it. 10 of those beds are ICU beds here in this tent right behind us. Those will be able to provide for the sickest patients with ventilators and support and management.
The city accounts for almost half of the country's total confirmed cases, and its hospitals are being overrun with COVID-19 patients. However, on Monday morning, New York welcomed an enormous U.S. Naval Hospital ship, which can ease some of the pressure by treating up to 1,000 non-coronavirus patients, including those who require surgery and critical care. While Europe is still struggling, many experts, including the World Health Organization, are cautiously predicting that countries like Italy and Spain could be approaching a peak in their surges of confirmed cases. They also say European lockdowns, which were initiated several weeks ago, will start to bear fruit. Italy has been witnessing a decline in the daily number of newly confirmed cases for nearly 5 straight days now. However, the virus is spreading fast across India and Central America. Despite India's lockdown of its 1.3 billion citizens, over 1,200 cases were confirmed on Tuesday. The number of confirmed cases across Latin America has now surpassed 16,000, with Brazil and Mexico reporting over 4,600 and 1,100 cases respectively as of Monday. Kim Hyo-sun, Arirang News.
The top finance chiefs and central bankers of G20 countries say they'll present a coronavirus action plan in the next 2 weeks to address the debt vulnerabilities of the emerging economies and provide financial support to those nations. During their second video conferencing on Tuesday, their second in just over a week, they talked about how the IMF and the World Bank could ease the lack of liquidity in growing economies, which have already witnessed a combined capital outflow of some $83 billion. The G20 will also work with the group's Financial Stability Board to coordinate regulatory and supervisory measures taken in reaction to the COVID-19 crisis. South Korea's central bank has offered over $8 billion in short-term loans to local financial institutions to lessen the blow of the COVID-19 pandemic. It is the first round of dollar lending using the BOK's recently agreed currency swap deal with the Federal Reserve. The Bank of Korea says the move is aimed at stabilizing the currency market. Our Lee Seung-jae tells us more.
$8.72 billion. That's the amount the Bank of Korea offered in loans to local banks and other financial institutions on Tuesday during a 30-minute online auction to provide them with $80 million in 7-day debt and $7.92 billion to be paid back within 84 days. The figure was below the BOK's initial expectation of $10 billion, which the central bank said was due to the considerable easing of the local dollar crunch.
The bidding amount was smaller than the bidding size is, because it's in foreign currency liquidity isn't that bad right now.
According to the BOK, the dollar injection will stabilize the currency market, with more auctions to take place depending on the market situation. The amount is the first batch of the central bank's $60 billion currency swap agreement it recently signed with the Federal Reserve, aimed at tackling a dollar crunch and a plunge in the local currency amid the COVID-19 outbreak and flatlining oil prices. South Korea signed its first currency swap deal with the U.S. in 2008 to cushion the country from the fallout caused by the global financial crisis. Successful bidders from Tuesday's auction will receive the dollars within the next 24 to 48 hours. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
South Korea's exports edged down slightly in the month of March from a year earlier, with the COVID-19 outbreak having a limited impact. The Trade Ministry said this Wednesday that the total amount of outbound shipments in the month of March amounted to some $46.9 billion, a drop of 0.2% on year. March imports were down 0.3% to $41.8 billion, and the trade surplus came to around $5 billion in March, with exports exceeding imports for 98 straight months. Today, April 1st, 2020, marks the first time in 60 years that South Koreans working for U.S. Forces Korea have been put on an unpaid leave due to a lapse in the defense cost-sharing agreement. But South Korean official says that the two sides have temporarily settled their differences and may announce their agreement as early as this Wednesday. Our Kim Ji-yeon reports.
South Korean employees of U.S. Forces Korea have been caught in something of a crossfire, the result of Seoul and Washington's failure to hammer out a revised special measures agreement. Around half of the total 9,000 South Korean employees currently working at the USFK have been put on unpaid leave starting Wednesday, a move widely seen as the U.S. trying to gain an upper hand in defense cost-sharing talks with South Korea. Seoul's chief negotiator Chung Eun-bo said late Tuesday the decision is regretful and expressed condolences to the employees and their families impacted by the furlough.
Seoul and Washington have reached the final stages of the defense cost-sharing agreement after the last round of talks held in mid-March in the U.S. The two sides have understood the furlough does not help support the defensive readiness of the combined military forces.
Chung expressed regret towards the U.S.'s decision and said the South Korean government had provided several options since February, both in terms of existing national defense budget and coming up with a separate agreement to prevent the furlough. Nevertheless, Chung said the two sides are doing their utmost to narrow their differences and to conclude the last phase of the defense cost-sharing negotiations. The U.S. is believed to have asked Seoul for around $4 billion, more than 4 times the amount paid last year. Seoul have instead suggested a 10% increase from last year's figure of $870 million. The two sides have held 7 rounds of SMA talks since last September but have been unable to strike a deal. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
In other news, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has criticized leaderships of North Korea, Iran, and Venezuela for their behavior on coronavirus that he says inflicts harm on their own people. Despite those strong words, he reaffirmed the Trump administration stance that humanitarian and medical supplies are exempt from sanctions the U.S. has imposed on them. The remarks came as Pompeo was addressing reporters on Tuesday local time on whether the U.S. could consider easing sanctions to help fight the COVID-19 pandemic. He also stressed that some of these countries continue to develop nuclear weapons and missiles while their own people are dying from famine. On Tuesday, a UN human rights expert called for lifting international sanctions against countries like Iran, North Korea, and Venezuela to ensure that food supplies reach hungry populations during the pandemic. Children's literature author and illustrator Baek Hee-na has been named the winner of this year's Astrid Lindgren Memorial Award for her picture book, Cloud Bread. She is the first South Korean to win what is known as the world's biggest children's book award in terms of prize money. Also known as the Nobel Prize for Children's Literature, the award was established by the Swedish government back in 2002 to honor fairy tale writer Astrid Lindgren, known for the character Pippi Longstocking. For this year's award, a total of 240 nominees from 67 countries made it to the final list. Baek's original book, The Cloud Bread, has been a big hit and has even been made into musicals and a TV series.
Good morning. Weather conditions will vary depending on where you are on this first day of April. Jeju and the south coast will see light spring showers, which will let up before noon today, while the east coast will see rain through tonight with 5 to 10 millimeters expected. Northwestern regions, including Seoul, will have a dry and dusty day, though. The capital area is under a dry weather advisory for the 5th day in a row now, and central regions and Jeollabuk-do provinces will need to be aware of high levels of fine dust. But nothing much to complain about temperature-wise. Afternoon highs will be hovering around 20 degrees Celsius in most parts, but Jeju will be breezier at 15 degrees and much more sunshine on the way for the latter half of the day. It's going to be cooler tomorrow morning, but highs will remain above the norms, but let's all dress accordingly as wide temperature gaps between lows and highs will continue. That's Korea for you, and here's the international weather for News Around the Globe.
And that's all the news we have at this hour, but we'll be back with more of the day's headlines coming up in our later newscast at noon Korea time. Thank you for watching and goodbye.
Mm-hmm.